it's a very different situation there. But anyway, I'm in a good mood today. I have two caveats from my talk to begin with. First is that this is not based on a paper or even a work in progress yet. It's just an idea for a paper that I've been thinking about for a couple years. It's really a first step toward getting back into the whole world state issue, which I've been away from for over 10 years. So this is really a first cut. And as such, your reactions can make a big difference actually to how the paper evolves in the future. The other caveat is that this is an entirely normative paper or normative talk. It's really a political theory paper, which I've never done before. So this is really quite a departure for me intellectually, and it means I have a lot of homework to do still on sort of getting up to speed on the literature and so on. But hopefully the basic intuition that I have will still be relatively fresh and interesting. Okay. So the question I want to address here is whether, other things being equal, whether a world state would be normatively superior to a system of plural sovereignty, which I'll equate with anarchy. Or putting the question a bit more strongly, is a world state essential to realize justice on a global scale? Okay. As I'll discuss briefly in a few minutes, I think the balance of scholarly opinion on this issue, and certainly a public opinion, is very much against the idea of a world state. So much so that I would say it's mostly taken for granted that a world state should be off the table in international political theory discussions. Put another way, plural sovereignty or anarchy seems to be the default position normatively in most of IR and political theory scholarship. And so the burden of proof is on advocates of a world state to answer the question, well, why a world state? Okay. So my goal here is not to convince you that a world state, or convince, presumably you guys are already on board, but convince whoever's watching this video, is not to convince you that a world state is superior to anarchy. Rather, my goal is a bit more modest, which is to try to shift the burden of normative proof onto defenders of anarchy and plural sovereignty or territorial state sovereignty. So what I'm trying to do here is to shift the default position from, well, of course we go with anarchy, to, of course we go with a world state, and then it's up to the skeptics to make a case for why we would not want a world state and we would prefer anarchy instead. So that's all I'm trying to do, which is nonetheless, I think important, but still it's only a first step in the larger conversation. So how to do this, how to make this shift in the burden of proof? Well, my strategy in the talk and in the eventual paper, if there is one, is to show that the alternative to a world state, a system of plural sovereignty or anarchy, is actually a form of despotism. And the title of my talk and of this paper is going to be Anarchy as Despotism. Okay. And what I want to show is that actually anarchy is a far more despotic system than any world state that one could possibly imagine ever emerging. And that such a despotic anarchic system has no normative justification. So that's sort of what I'm going to try to make the case for in my talk. So the rest of the talk, I'm going to sort of briefly define what I mean by the state, and therefore a world state. Then I want to very briefly just sort of summarize my assessment of the literature on the world state normatively. And then the core of the talk really is two main arguments kind of challenging the case for plural sovereignty or anarchy. One of which I'll call a liberal argument, and the other I'm calling a more communitarian or, communitarian kind of argument. Okay. All right. So, and then the despotism issue will emerge at the end in the conclusion. Okay. All right. So let me turn to defining the state. As we all know, there are lots of different definitions out there. These reflect both intellectual debates in state theory and, of course, the myriad of functions that real-world states perform on the ground. Whatever the merit, I'm not going to get into the debates and the merits of different definitions and so on. I think if we're talking about, though, whether a world state is normatively desirable, I think whatever definition we have, it should be a hard case in the sense of a definition of stateness that really brings the normative issues out completely so that they can be dealt with in a very direct way. And in my view, this hard case of stateness, or the idea of stateness, comes down to the state's ability and authority to make war on enemies, whether internal or external. in effect, the state's ability to decide who may live and who must die is sort of, as I see it, the core of the territorial state. So for my purposes, the conceptualization of the state has two different dimensions. One is simply the ability to kill in an organized fashion with an army or a police or so on. So that's kind of a capability dimension. And this lines up, I think, with Weber's monopoly of organized violence, okay, as a definition of the state. And then the other part of the definition is on the more normative side, which is the right to kill, okay? And that this, I think, lines up more with Schmitt's view of sovereignty, which is that the state, the sovereign, in other words, has the final right to decide the exception to any rules that are out there and to constitute enemies and, if necessary, to kill them, okay? So this definition of the state, I think, informs my assumption about what a world state would entail. First, and taking up the second part of the definition first, a world state, the locus of authority to declare a state of exception would no longer be the territorial state, it would be the world state. So it would be centralized as opposed to pluralized. And secondly, this world state must command some kind of monopoly of force globally. That might be a UN army, it might be a combination of national armies, I'm not sure how it would be done, but the point is that there has to be an ability to enforce the writ of the global state, not just having the authority, but actually the ability to enforce. Just parenthetically, I would note that these arrangements on the issue of security and violence say nothing about how the rest of a world state might be organized. In my view, it should and would be as decentralized as possible, probably along the lines of the principle of subsidiarity in the European Union. So I'm only talking here about who controls organized violence and really nothing else, okay? So given this definition of stateness, and setting aside the empirical question of just how realistic is this idea of a future world state, which is a totally different issue, the normative issue that I want to address is how should this stateness be organized? Should stateness be plural, or should stateness be unitary at the global level? Okay. So turning briefly to the literature, I think intuitively, you would think that, of course, a world state would be preferable to anarchy, in part because it would end war, or at least it would turn war into crime, which could then be crushed by the global elite paramilitary counterterrorism machine. So that was supposed to be a joke. So, but anyway, the balance, I think, of scholarly opinion, I think here, both historically and today, is very, very heavily on the side of plural sovereignty, anarchy, and against a world state. And I think this skepticism goes back at least to Kant, and I'm sure some of you guys know this much better than I, for whom a decentralized cosmopolitan republican system would, in Hegel's terms, be the end of history. And Kant's big worry, of course, about a world state is still, I think, the most commonly heard objection today, which is that it would be a tyranny or a despotism of some kind. Okay. However, in recent years, I think there's actually been a surprising amount of work, in just literally the past 10 years, by political theorists and philosophers giving additional arguments against a world state, which I think overlap and complement this tyranny argument. So just very briefly, and these are coming from both cosmopolitans and communitarians. So briefly, a world state would be too large to be governable and therefore would be ineffective. Secondly, that it would be superfluous because once you have a global cosmopolitan system, there's no need for a world state. Third, a world state would undermine cultural or national identities or otherwise threaten pluralism. Fourth, a world state would be so remote from ordinary people that it would be seen as illegitimate. So this is the democratic deficit kind of argument, which is different than the effectiveness argument. This is more of a normative argument. Fifth, people might argue that a world state could not foster levels of communal solidarity sufficient to support global redistribution or other projects that states might normally engage in. Sixth, people have argued that territorial states should have a right to exclude immigrants that they don't want to have as part of their community. So there's the whole immigration debate. And finally, of course, some people have argued, and there's actually now quite a bit of literature on the idea that states have a right to the territorial space that they control, so territorial property rights, so to speak. Now, of course, there are a few people on the other side. Morgenthau famously in the 60s arguing that a world state would be great. Of course, we just can't get one, but he's in favor of the idea normatively. Bill Shoreman, perhaps. There are a few others who have argued in favor of the idea of a world state, partly on the grounds of in war, partly on human rights grounds, and so on. But as an IR person, when I read this literature on the world state, I am very struck by how tilted the playing field is, in political theory especially, against the idea of a world state. That's not surprising, I think, for communitarians, who I would expect to defend plural sovereignty and anarchy. But what has really struck me is that cosmopolitans, too, mostly have been very reluctant to embrace the idea of a world state. So this seems to be one thing that communitarians and cosmopolitans can agree on, is that we don't want to have a world state. So is a world of plural sovereignty normatively superior to a world state or not? Okay. I will concede up front that in a non-ideal world like today, where other states retain their sovereignty and might use it to attack us, whoever us is, then each state should have the right of self-defense to protect itself, just as the UN Charter says. Okay, so normatively, that's very much a state-centric, plural sovereignty kind of bias. All right, but that, of course, assumes a world of plural sovereignty as a starting point, and in that sense, I think normatively it begs the question. And so my question is, can such a world of plural sovereignty itself be justified at all vis-a-vis a world state world? Okay, so this puts my argument in the domain of ideal theory and not non-ideal theory. But that terrain, of course, is the common terrain of political theorists, and it also seems to be the terrain of many critics of the idea of a world state. So I think it's natural to sort of tackle the issue on that ideal level. And my basic idea or intuition for this would-be paper is that there is a basic normative contradiction between, on the one hand, the principles of liberalism and democracy that most political theorists and basically most academics in the West hold dear, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the very idea of territorial or plural state sovereignty. So I want to argue these two things are fundamentally contradictory. In other words, if you believe in liberalism and democracy, there is no justification for plural sovereignty or anarchy, and as such, you should be in favor of a world state, is what I would like to claim. Okay. So to show this, I want to develop two arguments against the idea of plural sovereignty that in effect try to denaturalize plural sovereignty, to try to sort of get it off its default position and to make the case that actually this has to be justified, not just simply taken as given. One of these arguments I'll call liberal, and this is a more quick argument, and the other I'll call a more democratic argument. Okay. So let me go through these both relatively quickly. How am I doing on time? All right, I'm okay. So the liberal argument, call this a Rawlsian veil of ignorance argument. Imagine that human beings have the opportunity to design the world political system from scratch. We start this position in Rawls' original position, in which each of us is an unattached, unencumbered individual living among 10 billion, say, other individuals in a state of nature. Okay. And the choice each of us is voting on is whether to create a world of plural sovereignty, where there are, for example, 190 separate states, each of which has the right to kill foreigners. Or we can choose a world state where there's only one such authority that has the right to kill. Moreover, assume, as Rawls does, that there's a veil of ignorance here surrounding each of us, such that we don't know whether we will end up as citizens of a great power like the United States or China, or citizens of a state like Chad, Costa Rica, or for that matter, Iraq. Okay. Faced with such a choice, what would rational voters choose? What would you choose? It seems to me that, other things being equal, it would make far more sense to opt for a world where there's only one sovereign who can kill you than a world of hundreds of sovereigns who can kill you. In short, from a Rawlsian or liberal perspective, coming out of a state of nature, it seems to me we should choose a world state. So that's the liberal kind of line, which I take as more like a cosmopolitan kind of story. The other argument is more of a democratic theory line, which I sort of associate with a more communitarian perspective. And this one I think is a bit harder, and I think therefore more interesting. Rawls's original position, state of nature scenario that I just talked about, is obviously highly contrived, and in particular does not acknowledge that people are born into pre-existing communities with their own customs, traditions, languages, and so on. So instead of a world of deracinated abstract individuals, let's assume in this alternative argument that in the beginning, in the original position, there are already different communities out there, culturally different communities, not politically, but culturally different communities in which individuals are members. So this is a communitarian kind of story. From there, the defender of plural sovereignty might argue that people should be free to associate with whoever they want to. And these associations should in turn have the freedom to protect themselves against other free associations. And presumably these free associations would be organized on cultural, linguistic, ethnic lines and so on. So this would be kind of like a club theory of territorial states or of plural sovereignty, where each community is a spontaneously emerging, culturally constituted club that has the right to exclude non-members and defend itself, if necessary, against other clubs. So for the sake of argument, let me just set aside two obvious objections to this picture. One is that many communal loyalties that are often taken as granted were historically created by states through coercive socialization, and so they're not spontaneous at all. Okay. And the other obvious objection is, well, who gets to decide which clubs get which territory? Who gets Greenland versus who gets Saudi Arabia? Okay, so there's obviously a big normative issue there as well. But I want to set aside those kinds of objections, and I want to focus instead on a more democratic theory objection. And that is starts out like this. The fundamental principle of democracy, as I'm sure you all sort of already understand, is that power should be accountable to those it affects. Now, usually in democratic theory, this principle of affected interests is often thought to apply only to one's own citizens, of the citizens of your own demos or your own state. Okay. And historically, that made sense. Historically, with the exception of big interstate wars, most of the power to which individuals were subject was power coming from the national state or other actors within the nation state, people who are citizens of your own state. But today, of course, in a rapidly globalizing world, it is increasingly difficult to justify such a limited application of the democratic principle. Canadian citizens are routinely and deeply affected by decisions of America's government. So why shouldn't they have a say in how the power of the American government is wielded over them? And then, of course, there is the problem of war. Whatever you think of the Iraq War, Iraqi citizens were deeply affected and traumatized by the Bush administration's decision to invade their country. Okay. And now they have no recourse to the US or to any other higher body for all the damages that were inflicted upon their country as a result. Now, of course, the US administration thought it had good national security reasons for the invasion, but why should the US be the judge in its own case? Okay. So nonetheless, it might be responded that countries are still free associations and democratic principles should only apply within those associations. But I think this is vulnerable to a basic fundamental objection, which is known as the boundary problem in democratic theory, on which there's been a lot of work in recent years. Namely, the idea of society as a free association already assumes a distinction or a boundary between those who have a vote in constituting that association and those who do not. So the problem here then is how can you that boundary between us and them, between those who are in and out of the association, how can that boundary be justified in democratic terms? That's the democratic boundary problem. How to justify the boundary between polities in democratic terms. And in fact, I think that this, in practice, is impossible to do democratically. And if you look at the democratic boundary problem literature, it all falls back on ethnicity, language, or historical accident. They don't really have a good democratic answer to why there should be more than one polity. Because in fact, as soon as you constitute a polity as exclusionary, anybody on the outside of that polity is going to be affected by the decisions of that polity. Just think US and Mexico. If we draw a boundary along the Rio Grande, everybody in Mexico is suddenly going to be affected by American power and have absolutely no say in how that power is wielded. Okay. So I don't think there is a democratic argument except for a global demos. And this is what a few of the articles on the democratic boundary problem literature have pointed to, is the only way to solve this boundary problem democratically is to say that the demos has to be global. And then if all 10 billion of us get to vote and we decide to have 190 states, okay, that's fine. That's a different matter than starting out with 190 states and then trying to figure out what to do. Okay, so, all right. So I think just by way of conclusion, I'm running out of time here, I think what what I'm calling the liberal and democratic arguments against plural sovereignty suggests is that any system of plural sovereignty, any system of what might be called organized anarchy, okay, is in fact a form of despotism, at least from the point of view of the individual citizens on the ground, not obviously from the point of view of the rulers, the despots, but from the point of view of citizens. Namely, and the reason for this is that what organized anarchy or plural sovereignty really amounts to is a system in which sovereigns collude to maintain a system of collective rule in which citizens who are attached to different sovereigns, coercively so to speak, in which citizens may be killed arbitrarily by foreign sovereigns in wars decided by those sovereigns, and for which killings there is no subsequent accountability unless you happen to be weak and get caught. So I think that in fact, yeah, okay, I'll skip that point. Okay, so there's still a so what question here at the end, and this is how I'll wrap up, because I know I'm out of time, pretty much. We're obviously a long way from a world in which this is going to be possible, but I think this is still an interesting argument in two ways. First, at the level of ideal theory, I think the argument hopefully will change the burden of proof in the whole despotism debate, so to speak, about the world state. Namely, it's not as if that a system of plural sovereignty or anarchy is despotism free, and therefore we have to somehow justify the possible despotism in a world state. Rather, it just takes a different form. In plural sovereignty or anarchy, what we have is the despotism of war, or the institution of war, in which individuals have no say because they are subject to their sovereigns. Okay. So I think this gives us a response to Kant's skepticism about a world state. Namely, once the cosmopolitan federation has been created, the question is not why go on and create a world state. Rather, the question should be why not do so? Because to refuse to do so would, I think, show bad faith. Put another way, if we were going to design the world today from scratch, and I'm reiterating my earlier point, we would never, I think, create a world of 190 separate sovereignties. It just makes no sense at all. There are huge negative externalities and very few benefits from such a world. So that's one implication. The other one, and then I'll be done, on a more empirical level, my argument is intended to highlight that there is this what I'm calling a structural contradiction at the heart of the modern international system between liberalism and democracy on the one hand, both of which I think are universalistic, and on the other hand, plural sovereignty, which is inherently particularistic. I think this contradiction over time will only intensify, especially as cultural differences erode and liberal democracy becomes more and more universal. As I always ask my undergrads at the end of my semester teaching with them, I ask them, what if the rest of the world becomes America, culturally, politically, and so on? How do you justify retaining American sovereignty against all these other Americans who are across the border? And they really struggle with this. It's hard to justify maintaining a border if everybody is now America, so to speak. So in the long run, I don't see how plural sovereignty can survive normatively because it doesn't have any normative legs to stand on. So the final thing I'll say then is that one might say that a world state, or sovereignty I should say, is a natural monopoly in a sense, in the economic sense, at the global level. So I'll leave it at that. Okay.